big thanks that you find your way to this building. It's close to COP, but still you have to go out and find us. I don't know how many of you already participated in other lunch sessions during this week. Can you make just hands up? Okay, so some of you have a history of lunch meetings now. Welcome to today's session, which is on ecosystem-based adaptation, planning and implementation. So we will really try to look at action on the ground, what is already implemented, what are the hurdles, what are the challenges, but also what are options to increase uptake. And we will do this by listening to one speaker, one keynote speaker, Arno Sckeyde from GIZ. Then I will invite our panel to join me here, and everybody will provide around 5-minute input from his or her experience. Some of you brought slides, some of you didn't, so it will be a bit a mixed picture of talks and short slide-based presentations. And then we will go on with a panel discussion. We brought some pictures, but this will be open up to the audience, so everybody can contribute. Thank you very much for being here. And can you find the space? There are two, and here are two. Just come in, 1.5 hours to long.
There are more coming actually, so maybe we just give them a couple of minutes to come inside. Try to find a seat somewhere.
So we are already having here some cooperation on the ground by people moving to make space for others. Thank you very much for that.
Is there one more seat?
There are two, one more there. Okay, so maybe second part of the intro. So my name is Zita Sebesvari. I am with United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security here in Bonn. And I'm very pleased to invite Arno Sckeyde to today's key lecture presentation. So Arno is with GIZ and leading actually the global program called Mainstreaming EBA, Strengthening Ecosystem-Based Adaptation and Planning and Decision-Making Processes. So he is with GIZ since a very long time. I looked at your CV. I think you started like 81 or something like this. At that time it was called GTZ still. And before you joined this mainstream EBA global program, Arno worked in the sector which is called, what is it? Biodiversity, forestry and natural resources. So you have been involved in the FEED process and also advising projects related to the work of the CBD. And I welcome here Sakura from CBD. Thank you that you spend your time with us today here. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to start your presentation. And I must highlight that our event is video streamed, so that if you have any problem with that, then please, just you are aware.
It's not very visible there. Okay, thank you, Zita, for the nice welcoming. Welcome everybody. I wasn't really expecting that I have to be a keynote lecture, so I was not expecting to give you an overview to set the scene for the discussion that's going to follow, which I'm really happy to do. Let me just take you through the yes. Now this is the content of my presentation. First of all, I take the liberty to speak a little bit of the concept of EBA. So just to make sure we are all on the same page and that we have a good basis to start from. Then I will shortly speaking about the relevance of EBA within an international policy framework, followed by some aspects of planning of EBA measures, and probably most important, we touch on some of the examples of implementation experience of EBA, and to conclude with some lessons learned from implementing EBA projects. And all that I'm expecting to do in 15 minutes, so please forgive me if I cannot go into very much detail, but I think we have the chance to discuss further after the presentation. Now, what is the concept of the EBA? Ecosystem-based adaptation. It stems from, or it comes from, it was coined back in 2008 at the COP, and it was carried into the COP of 2009, and it is defined as being the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of, that's important, an overall adaptation strategy. And also is aimed to help people to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. So that narrows it really in, so not every thing that looks like EBA is EBA, but we will come to that later. But I don't think we have to spend too much time on defining the EBA, because tomorrow at the same time, same place, my colleague from IUCN will stand here and will do a lot of work on criteria qualification standards. And jointly with our colleagues from IUCN, we have just issued a technical paper on qualification criteria and quality standards for EBA, just to inform the discussion, because where we start talking about EBA, we will immediately have the discussion, what is actually EBA? But to drill deeper into that issue, that will be tomorrow. EBA is an overarching issue, really. It has synergies with all these various sectors, and there are overlaps with other concepts such as natural resource management, sustainable land management, and community-based approaches. That is, on one hand, it is quite challenging, because it makes it even more difficult to exactly tell what is EBA, no? And where does it end and where does it start. It makes it a very demanding task, because coming to it later, it implies that implementing EBA, we need to coordinate with many different sectors. EBA in the international framework. As I just mentioned, the concept of EBA goes back to the COP number 14, and in 2010 it became a funding priority of the ICI initiative, being UB. 2012, EBA got incorporated into the international conventions from UNFCCC in Rio +20, and later 2013 it also found its way into the Nairobi work program. Now the ICI EBA portfolio, and that's not the latest figure, it has reached an all-time high, I think of 145 million euro have been invested into EBA projects worldwide. And let me just, before I come back to the finance and EBA, have a look into the international conventions where EBA played a role. I can assure you EBA is deeply steeped into many of the international conventions, starting with the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, goal number 13, so climate action, goal number 15, life on land, and many more. And I'm not going to run down all these goals on you now, but be assured it's deeply steeped into many of these conventions and international conventions. Same goes for the Paris Agreement. It is steeped into Article 7 on adaptation, in many articles. Also, that I'm not going to read out to you, but the presentation will be available, I think so. access the information later. The EBA portfolio, that it is increasing. The ICI funding in total since 2008 has reached some 1.7 billion euro. And in total, for EBA, we are at 145 million now. So that's, I think it's quite impressive, and it makes it EBA the greatest initiative worldwide to finance the EBA projects. And that's a distribution of EBA projects worldwide. As you can see from the map, there's a fairly clear focus on South America. These are projects, the dark green projects are projects implemented by the GIZ. Yes, are implemented by colleagues of IUCN, UN organizations, TNC, CI, and others. As the Green Climate Fund is gaining increasingly importance as a donor organization, we are quite thrilled to learn that this is a funding priority also for the Green Climate Fund. So, but as you might know, it's not quite a very easy task to draft a proposal. Well, that's quite demanding, but it opens up options for EBA definitely in the future. Now, when it comes to planning of EBA, that's, I think, for many of us that's quite familiar with adaptation, mainstream cycle with its 6 steps. Mostly starting with assessing vulnerability, then identifying adaptation options, prioritizing them, and then implementation. Interestingly, that is a little bit, that is the scope of possible adaptation options. They reach from purely political, social options over infrastructure-based options, EBA hybrid, to purely ecosystem-based options. So the latter, they are mostly very much neglected in the public financing and decision making. So what are typical ecosystem-based, pure typical ecosystem-based options? That's probably mostly known as replanting of mangroves, the replanting of stream buffers, reducing upland logging, and reduce coal extraction. That's on the green side. On the opposite side, engineering options, we have the reinforcement of river banks, building sea walls, increasing drainage, and improved bridges. On the political side, and on the social options, this is regulating land tenure and reserving land use, flood warning systems, and mapping. So these are typical examples for these 3 sectors. Now to the implementation of EBA activities, projects. Just very few examples. Starting with one example from our project in Thailand. They are working in the water sector. They are working on buffer strips. What you see here, it's a bit like a canal, like a river, with agriculture activities going exactly down to the river, and it's very sensitive to erosion and sediments, and it costs a lot of money for maintenance. It will also practically rest of fertilizers, the pesticides, they are mostly washed into the river, and that leads to a high degree of pollution. Alternatively, that's what the project is doing, they are promoting buffer strips. That means one has to reserve some strips at sites, which is a cheap solution, and it doesn't need much maintenance, and it improves water conservation and reduces mainly the risk of floods. Another example is floodplains. What you see here is really that is the traditional, you can know that from your own experience, way, I think that's probably a photo from Thailand, could also be Vietnam, where agriculture activities are really go directly almost into the river, so there's no sign of any buffer zone and nothing. So that's really that invites erosion, and it doesn't really provide for reducing flood risk. On the other hand, that is another example. If you have floodplains, that is really something that reduces flood risk tremendously. It supports groundwater recharge, provides groundwater-rich habitats, and also it helps to filter the groundwater. So that is now Vietnam. Many of you probably know Vietnam, and due to its very long coastline and river deltas with low elevations, Vietnam is very likely to be the most vulnerable country probably in the world, or one of those. And the project that is looking into coast protection is a project that is cooperating with Australian aid on integrated coastal and mangrove protection. This is the it's the approach. It's a discharge regime is coming from the Mekong River that has a lot of sediments and water that into the sea. That's on the one hand, and from the other side, there's a very heavy wave regime. Also, it attacks the coastline. So the activities that the project is taking. Just show you this. If you look to the left, that is the coastline. That's a very thin mangrove plantation that has been left. That most of it was chopped down over the centuries, and in the background you see the shrimp farming. Yeah, the risk, sea level, strong waves that cause a lot of coastal erosion. I mentioned that. And agriculture and shrimp farms, also they contribute to degradation of mangroves, and which leads to bare land, and with that to reduce erosion control. Now the idea is how to counter this is to reduce the impact of the waves coming from the seaside, and at the same time helping to reduce the sediments that come from inside the land to be washed into the sea. And what the project did was they have it used what they call T-fences. If you look at that carefully, you can see those T kind of structures over there, right? These are mostly made of bamboos, and they're very efficient in terms of increasing the capacity of the land, and also to help the mangroves to regrow, because mangroves, they do not really grow in troubled water. Yeah? So what those steel fences do is they would reduce the impacts coming from the sea itself on the one hand, and on the other hand help to catch the sediments coming from inside the land. And these are some photos taken over a period of more than 1 year. It starts to the left in May 2012. That's what it looks like then. And a little more than 1 year later, it looked quite differently, with mangroves regrowing and sediments being kept. So this is quite a complex project. There's a brochure on that. It's a special study on the ZEF health and the ZEF wealth, which is available, and I would encourage you to read it. It's really very interesting. Jumping to the conclusions that the study comes from is that the overall economic impact of planting mangroves is much more favorable in terms of economic terms than building dikes, because it provides much more benefits than mangroves would do. Besides its benefits for coastal protection, mangroves also significantly contribute to biodiversity, as we know. And, one of the conclusions was also that in theory also just dikes would do the job. They would prevent the water can go into the hinterland. So, but practically it would be a very difficult and very expensive undertaking just to have dikes. So this is also a combination of both. It's a combination of green and what we call grey infrastructure. I have another example from nearby, from Brandenburg, which is about relocation of a dike. As you can see here, this is a yellow line that close to the river. That is the old dike that was relocated. Away from the river, and it provided some 400 something, where was it, hectare of floodplains. And this has a very good effect on the biodiversity, and it dramatically helps to reduce the risk of floods, and also it's very cost efficient, because a new dike is like 20% shorter than the old dike, and so the maintenance costs are dramatically low, or has a low proportion. So, and the nice thing about it also that this dike, which is the Elbe cycle route, has become the busiest cycle route in Germany, and the planners that they said back in 1995 that cycling on our dikes never. But so that proves the contrary. So that is also quite a nice example, I think, for ecosystem-based adaptation. Yeah. So as time is limited, and there's much more examples out there, I would encourage you to have a look what the Panorama solution platform provides, because this was introduced by IUCN, GIZ, and other organizations as to capture and make available natural-based solutions on a web platform. And so under Panorama, www.panorama.solutions, you will find a lot more very impressive examples. And I would also like to use this opportunity to encourage you to become solution providers yourself, because we have these 3 portals so far. One is on protected areas, and the others on marine and coastal solutions, and then the EBA portal itself. So, not sure, have you taken care of this? I think in the EBA we have like more than 50, close to 60 examples, yeah. So we still wanting more. So please become providers. That would be great. This is the platform. That's where you find the examples. Let me just conclude with some lessons learned from the discussion that follows. The first is that grey infrastructure measures are still the general practice, unfortunately, due to a lack of systematic comparison with green infrastructure and limited awareness of EBA co-benefits. That's the reason that's given. Secondly, intersectoral coordination between government agencies is of limited. Governance systems need to be strengthened. This is important. And thirdly, EBA is a process. It needs to be integrated into existing policies, strategies, and decision-making processes. Some more. We often hear from people that EBA measures are not exactly new. We have seen them before, but this is not new. What is EBA? You know? Is it what is really new? It is true. EBA measures sometimes come in disguise. You will find them in several sectors. You will find them in the agriculture sector. You will find them in the water sector. And they might not be called EBA, but according to the principles and guidelines, they are basically EBA. And as I said at the outset, it is important that EBA, that's a form part of an overall adaptation strategy. But an adaptation strategy just does not come from above, it's also been informed from below. So that means we have to look into the existing practice of what the people on the ground are doing, what the farmers do, and try to either together or let them inform policy. So that's the basis. And lastly, mainstream EBA means to find appropriate entry points in specific sectors. Entry points are definitely NDCs, ANNA processes are national policies, though there are various entry points, and they provide the energy or the willingness also to open up for new ideas, for new concepts. And as advisors, I think that's up to us to make use of these entry points. We have just we're busy doing a study on the entry points as we speak, and that will hopefully provide new insights as to where the barriers or also the opportunities are to integrating EBA into the policies, and also to get EBA out of the policies. It's nice to have EBA mentioned in the NDCs. That's good. But I think the next question is how do we get it out again? No? How do we get it into implementation? No? So that's I think that's good. That's to me that's one of the biggest challenges. But maybe we can come to that in the discussion. Further resources, yeah, you will find a lot of publications, webinars on Adaptation Community Net, yeah, coming soon we've just launched a study on valuing the benefits, costs, and impact on of ecosystem-based adaptation measures, which will be available very soon. Yeah, with that I'd like to close and maybe we should do it for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go on with questions to Arno, may I propose that the panelists come here because that would free 5 chairs. And I see some colleagues there who could value that option. So we would start now with immediate questions for Arno's presentation. If I I may, I would start with one question to Arno. So you mentioned your work in Vietnam, and you mentioned that it's really important to find entry points. Could you probably explain what kind of entry points you could use in that Vietnamese context, just to give us a bit more feeling what kind of entry points you can use as a global mainstreaming program?
Yeah, also taking the example of Vietnam, for example, they're very strong setting up regional policies, and they're also very willing to set up adaptation strategies on the regional level, and that means they politically there's a will and there are the means, and that provides the energy, which is as I said an entry point. And then there's a lot of experience, particularly in Vietnam, also on the ground. If you go to the villages, you will see how people how they adapt, how they use traditional techniques to counter the adverse effects of climate change, to counter floodings, to counter heavy rains. This is, as I said, it is not necessarily. It's not EBA. They have never heard that this is what they're doing called EBA, which is admittedly quite a bulky term. So we have to think about it, how we are going to use it, and in our work as advisors on the ground. So yeah, that could be the entry point on the political level, definitely, and that's where we as GIZ work basically, but also on very much on the ground, on the communities. So one has to communicate, one has to get people together and exchange experience and on practical measures. So that's also an entry point, and then feed it back into policy making. That is a challenge.
Thank you. I would like to open up to the audience, so feel free to ask immediate questions to the presentation, and then a more broader discussion we would start after we heard the inputs of the panelists as well. Do you have any question? I'm sure you have. Go ahead.
Because I want to hello, my name is Clyde. I'm a PhD student in UNU. I want to follow up Zita's question. So for the Vietnam's case, do you think NDCs, like the high commitment of Vietnam's government, do you think it's a chance for EBA measures to come in more initiatives and more investment going toward EBAs instead of other measures in terms of adaptation? Like, I mean, the NDCs, the high commitment of Vietnamese government for adaptation out of Paris Agreement. So do you consider that as a chance for EPA?
If I got you right, you mean if I see it as a chance that the EBA is deep in the NDCs of Vietnam?
Yeah.
Absolutely. To me, that is a if not only it's not maybe it is the first step, yeah, but it's reflected into the important and up-to-date policy papers and obligations, and definitely. So because that, to me, that creates a momentum, of course. So countries that mentioned EBA, for example, in the NDCs, I mean, they have to act on it. I mean, they have to do something with it. That's what I was trying to say when I said it's good if it's in the NDC, but the next question is, how do we get it out again? How do you get it into the various sectors? It is a multi-sectoral issue in EBA. It's a multi-sectoral issue. So if it might, if the Ministry, let's say, of Finance, who allocates funds, I mean, they have to see to that it goes into the right channel, so that it implies that an overall planning has to take place. What do we do with it? With this animal, with an EBA animal, what does it really mean? How does it affect other sectors? And so, coordination and governance. That to me is a core issue of EBA. But it's a chance, yes.
Other question? come on. It's your turn. Yeah.
What is the experience with trying to bring these different policy sectors together to get them to agree on something as comprehensive as EBA? How much success have people had in this field?
I wish I could tell you that straight away. It is very. I mean, the issue itself, it is not. It is quite new. But I think, isn't it the general issue? If the overarching issue has been introduced into policy of a country, how is it handled? How do the various sectors? How do they speak to each other? How does sectoral coordination take place? Is there political will? How is it will steered? And so, I think the question of the governance of EBA again is a very difficult one, because it is not only housed, as we might assume, in the ministry or the department that's been called differently from country to country, in the environmental department. That's probably the last important one, I would think. It has to, that issue, EBA has to enter into the agriculture sector, into the water sector, into many more sectors, into financial planning, first of all. That's how much important does the government allocate to this issue, and how serious is it been taken? And that again, that is informed, I think, by that not only the people on the ground, in the first place, they need to be convinced that this is a good concept. But secondly, also the politicians, they have to accept this is a viable option in comparison to much more traditional, what we call grey adaptation options. So, but the experience, I mean, that would be something for me, for the discussion. I mean, what are the experience here in the room? I mean, with coordinating. So I would like to throw it back to the floor, actually, because I think that there's much knowledge, experience on the issue. How does the government coordinate sector policies?
Is there somebody who can give one immediate example? Okay. So then I am taking this as an opportunity. I will turn to our panelists. I can promise you a very interesting panel covering mountainous areas, watersheds, forestry, and risk assessment-based identification of adaptation options, including ecosystem-based ones. I will introduce the panelists one by one. So first, I will start with Florencia, who then will give us 4 to 5 minute input, and then we will go on one by one. So that will be the procedure. So first, I welcome Florencia Zapata with us. She is an anthropologist and a naturalist, specialized in nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and also participatory methodologies. Since '99, so also quite a while, she's working at the Mountain Institute in the Andean program, and she's dedicated to the conservation of mountain ecosystems and sustainable rural livelihoods. Mainly in the highlands of Peru, if I understood it well. Currently she is Deputy Director for Institutional Development and Knowledge Management and a specialist for mountain ecosystem-based adaptation measures. So please give a warm welcome to your panel. We are looking forward to your examples and input.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Zita, for the warm welcome. And I would like to focus on the social and cultural dimensions of the ecosystem-based adaptation. Because according to our experience, those are the key components of any EBA measure at the local level. Because if you go to the Panorama website and you look at the hundreds of examples, you will see that those EBA measures are implemented at the local level. And at least in the Andes, when you go to an EBA measure, it is located on land which is owned by a community. Then when you are talking about EBA implementation and planning, you have to talk about the social and cultural dimensions. And although EBA goal is to help people to adapt to climate change, EBA definition is not explicitly focused on people participation and ownership. And this is something we have to stress. Although we are talking about environmental issues and environmental infrastructure, we are talking about the social dimension of ecosystem management. And for EBA to work, local people have to be involved from the very beginning, from the risk assessment, and not just as help receivers, but as the active leaders and owners. For example, in our case, we have been at the Mountain Institute working for more than 40 years on mountain ecosystem conservation based on local management, and 5 years especially on EBA implementation. And in the project we have been working on, focused on mountain ecosystem-based adaptation, not just in the Andes, but also in other mountains in the world. The pattern is the same. It is not enough to focus on risk assessment on green infrastructure. The base, the bottom line, if you want to talk about sustainability, is local ownership. Then, who is going to do the risk assessment? External researchers? Alone? Working with local people? What's the role of the local people? Do you need a team of practitioners that are trained also on participation? How do you train them? And when you talk about mainstreaming EBA, because we have several projects on mainstreaming EBA, how do you mainstream this focus on the social and the cultural dimension of EBA? This is something that we are exploring, and I would like to explore with all of you later.
Any immediate questions? Florencia?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. One of the problems is that central governments like to hold the power, they like to call the shots. What experience do you have of overcoming, or do you have any experience of any governments who are saying, yes, no, we recognize that participation is really important and we are going to deliberately devolve authority to local communities?
Yes, we are working on that. And it is interesting, it is not just for EBA, right? As Arno mentioned, EBA follows a long tradition of environmental conservation and community development. And we have been working with the government, at least in Peru, in order to think how to involve this dimension. But at the national government, it is really difficult because they are looking for the big picture, right? Then when working with the local governments and the local agencies is where we find the place to introduce this social and cultural dimension. Although at the national level it is important that policies give room to that. For example, the Environmental Ministry of in Peru, when developing the tools for including EBA in the national policy, is giving room to include information on the social and cultural dimensions of the EBA measures that will be implemented with national funding. They recognize it is important, and that those who assess the process and the projects have to look at that. But in detail, it should be included in when you develop the plan for the EBA measure, or when you work with the local government or the local agency. This is at least our experience.
So it's in process.
Yeah, it's in process, but you need to work bottom up and top down. Thank you. Yeah, at the same time, but in our case with the national government, just to be sure that in the national policies there is a focus on local participation and ownership. And those who will assess the EBA projects will look at that any EBA project will have a component on social organization and capacity building. That's at the national government level. But at the local level, with the local government or local practitioners, you need to work on that too. Training people, developing guides, manual, supporting local processes.
I may just ask one immediate question, because it's often said, and it makes sense to me, that EBA is a landscape approach. And if you look from that perspective, you also need this landscape level planning to be successful. So just would like to get your perspective how to align that landscape level approach with the community-based planning and maintenance.
Yes. Yeah, what I like about EBA definition is that it includes explicitly the bigger strategy. You need to look at the bigger strategy. The EBA measure alone will not succeed. You need to align or integrate the measure with what is going on at the community territory or the landscape level. For example, in our case, we implemented an EBA measure on grassland management in some communities of a protected area in the highlands of Peru. And two interesting points. One, those communities already had grassland management plans for several years, but they didn't use it. They had the plans, they had the papers, but they didn't apply those plans because they did not participate in the process of producing the plans. And the plans were not contextualized for the social and cultural realities of that community. But besides that, when we developed the EBA measure focused on the grassland management with the community, we developed with the community a management plan for that EBA measure. Looking for more than 1 year, we worked together trying to identify how this particular EBA measure will be integrated with the big picture. What are the municipal plans for grassland management in that area? The natural protected area, how is it going to work? How this EBA measure will integrate and will help also the natural protected area to achieve their goals. The same at the regional level, the same at the national level. The EBA measure is not alone. It should be connected and integrated with other strategies, bigger strategies going on at the landscape level, at least.
Thank you very much. More questions after the final presentation. So I would like to welcome now Luna Bharati. I understood that Luna is a researcher and project manager at the International Water Management Institute. The key areas of her research are integrated and sustainable water resources management, and she also worked quite a bit on assessing climate change risk and its impacts, as well as to plan adaptation strategies. She works actually in very different river basins, in small ones and in large ones. And prior joining IWMI, she worked actually here in this institute, and I understood that currently you are also based in Germany here at ZEF and working for IWMI on this distant-based work. I understood you have brought some slides you would like to share with us.
I find it
Out there.
find it difficult to talk without slides. So it's like my security sticker. But I'll try to be very short, and if I talk too much or too long, you'll stop me. So I'm a principal researcher, actually working for the International Water Management Institute, as I was introduced, but I'm currently based at ZEF, which is hosting me. So today I'll basically talk about, I was asked to give an example of ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, and I'm managing a project currently in Nepal. It's called Building Climate Resilience of Watersheds in Mountain Ecoregions. It's just in Nepal. And so how the project came to be is Nepal was selected as one of the countries to receive funds, international funds for adaptation. And the Asian Development Bank and World Bank were going to implement it. So the Asian Development Bank came to IMI, since we've been working on in the water sector in Nepal for many decades, and asked us, okay, what should we do? How can we use these funds? And so this is how the whole discussion, how the project came to be. And so the first thing we did was we did a vulnerability assessment to see where are people the most vulnerable against climate risks. And we identified, of course, mountain regions, especially because they're mainly dependent on agriculture and it's rain-fed agriculture. And at that time, and also now, there's this big perception that springs are drying out. And in these mountain watersheds, upland mountain watersheds, springs are actually the main source of water for drinking water as well as irrigation. So we thought, okay, let's develop a project based on looking at why these spring sources are drying up and what we can do to increase water availability in these mountain systems to make water more reliable, because these people and these communities are basically dependent on rainfall, and rainfall patterns have been erratic. Climate change projections are still very uncertain, in which direction it's going, but it's still, it's a problem. And so basically I, already talked about the context. And another thing is there's a lot of out-migration from these mountain watersheds into urban centers, into other countries, for environmental reasons, social reasons, economic reasons, but because of this, there's a lot of land degradation going on. And so that could also be one of the reasons why springs are drying up, for instance. And so, and talking about the governance, so we sort of conceptualized a project, identified that we're going to work on these mountain watersheds, but we had to find an institution to house this program. And so the Department of Soil Conservation and Watershed Management, it's under the Ministry of Forestry in Nepal. So we approached them together with ADB with this program because it is partially fund. I mean, that came as just a fund, but partially it would become a loan. And so we needed to get a government buy-in. But it was very difficult because the Department of Soil Conservation and Watershed Management, their expertise is in forest conservation and soil degradation, soil conservation. And they had they really didn't have a lot of experience working in water management. And to get them to agree to take this, take this project on board was one challenge. And then once they agreed, I don't know if this sort of changed on its own. Once they agreed, then the Ministry of Agriculture felt that they felt a little bit like this other ministry was coming into their domain, because we were also going to, because the water made available would also be used for irrigation. So there was, quite a bit of difficulty into which institution should take the lead. But in the end, I'll explain later if there's more interest in how we resolved this problem. And so, yeah. And then the other thing is, the management, even in the water world, the management of surface water and groundwater is done separately by separate groups of people, separate departments. And when you're talking about springs, it's, it sort of flows from the surface water to groundwater and back to surface water. So this has to be also done in an integrated way. And so this is the project which we then conceptualized. And so basically we try to integrate land, trees, watershed management that includes forest management, terrace management, agricultural management, and then also looking at how we can increase water availability. And so we had both gray and green infrastructure. So we built infiltration ponds, as well as small check dams, as well as did a lot of forest conservation, agriculture, looking at agricultural fields and trying to see what they can do for soil conservation, etc. And another thing is, with this, it has now become a very large program. The total budget is about 35 million. And so IWMI, we're the research, we're doing the research aspect where we conceptualize the project, and now we're basically monitoring its impact. And so it's the government of Nepal with a large consulting firm. They're implementing these interventions in these mountain watersheds. And so the project is ongoing. So we've set up a whole bunch of hydroclimatic stations, hydrological surveys, process modeling. All this is being done. And so in 2 pilot watersheds, we're monitoring the hydrological processes, because one of the other issues also in these mountain catchments is the whole biophysical processes aren't that well understood. For example, springs, where is the water coming from? Is it from the recent monsoon, or is it 10-year-old water being fed by the groundwater system? So things like that are very important to know in order to know how to manage them. And so this is going on, and in parallel, the government is also then putting in these watershed interventions. As I mentioned, there's 4 key things. One of them is forest conservation, managing degraded lands. We've also built some infiltration ponds to try to then get the surface water to feed the groundwater, so that groundwater is recharged, which then hopefully keeps the springs flowing. And then we're monitoring this process. It's a 5-year project, and we're on year 2. And so starting from year 4, we'll be able to see which of the interventions might have had more impact, and then the plan is to then outscale these approaches and extend it to a broader area. So I guess I'll stop now. Thank you.
Probably Florencia would ask you, did you use participatory methods to select some of the measures you implemented?
Yeah, well, when we did selected the watersheds where these, pilot interventions were going to be, that was a very extensive process as well. It was partly we did a vulnerability assessment just based on biophysical, but as well as socio-ecological data or socio-economic data. But then we had this first round of selection, and then we went to the government and also to the district, the government at 2 levels, the national level as well as the district level, to basically decide on which watersheds. And then, of course, the main objective of this whole program is to build resilience against climate change. And water scarcity was identified as one of the main risks that people are facing. So we had to then, it was from them that the whole idea came, or talking to stakeholders, that we need to make water availability, or need to try to make water availability more reliable. And this is, and holding back water, trying to hold back water in these mountain watersheds, so that the water use can be extended into the dry period. I mean, that was the main, objective. And another problem, I mean, talking about the different institutions and governance, the water management agencies in Nepal and a lot of countries that I've worked in, they're focused, I mean, the main use of water is irrigation. And most of the irrigated land are downstream in the river valleys, not in these upland catchments. So, for example, in one of the districts where we're working, Department of Irrigation didn't even have any presence there. They didn't have any office or anything because to them, this is, it's not a agriculturally viable land, and so it's and irrigation, a lot of irrigation is also not possible, so it's not interesting for them. And so, I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah. Do you have a question? Yep. Simona?
Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering whether you also have considering disaster risk reduction at least as a side aspect, because water and landslides in those hilly areas or mountainous areas are very much linked, particularly in Nepal. So maybe you could say a word about that.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that still needs to be proven, but conceptually, if you are able to hold back water in these catchments, then this problem of flooding, right after a storm event might be reduced. But it depends on how much water you can hold back. And so this is something we're also monitoring. So in our hydrological stations have been set up all along the upstream, small streams as well as down in the main river to see if that will make an impact as well. And then of course for the land degradation, all these conservation efforts will hopefully also reduce some soil erosion, etc. And then the drought, the other, whatever spectrum of disasters, floods and droughts. And for droughts, trying to increase the reliability of water availability would then make people more resilient also against drought.
I see here one more thing. You need to say now your name because
Sorry.
everybody who asks more than 2 questions needs to.
My name's Mike Jones. Really interesting, and I'd like to explore this question of the competition between the 3 different sectors for who leads the project. What was that competition about? Was it about the $35 million, or was it something else? And what might be done to reduce that competition and get them to collaborate instead of compete?
Getting institutions to collaborate is a difficult problem in general, I think. In whichever area, because I've also been working in trying to implement IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management, and that doesn't work either because, well, first of all, the funding, that is a major issue because whichever institution gets to implement the project also controls the budget, and of course then all these institutions are then in competition for control of the budget, but also it's space, if it's a forestry program, it goes to Ministry of Forestry. If it's a water program, it goes to Ministry of Irrigation in Nepal mainly. If it's they're even having difficulty implementing, for example, there's Ministry of Energy and Ministry of Irrigation are separate, and we have a Ministry of Agriculture, and so it's it's also the space. Who has the most power is also. And it's at all levels, whether it's at national level or at local level, this conflict comes up. And the way we resolved it a little bit in this project or program was basically a committee was formed with representatives from the relevant ministries, so agriculture, irrigation, welfare, environment, and then forestry, and then so most of the decisions had to be made. It had to be okayed by this committee, And so this is then at least acknowledging that, you know, this project sort of extends beyond the mandate of one ministry, and then it was accepted. But yeah, it's I think it's an issue everywhere to implement these sorts of integrated projects. I mean, they sound very nice, but the actual implementation is always problematic.
And based on your experience, do you have any thoughts about what sorts of organizational and institutional changes might help overcome this? It becomes more difficult. I mean, I'm not a governance person, I'm a hydrologist, and so it's a little bit extending my expertise, but in my opinion, at the lower level, I mean, I always say at a household level, everything is integrated. When I pay my bills, I pay my water bill, electricity bill, as well as buy my own food, you know, so it's all integrated. The higher up you go, the more difficult it becomes. At the national level, then that's where it becomes, the most difficult. And so it has to be incentivized to get these different sectors to work together. And how you incentivize it, you know, it depends on a case-by-case basis. For example, this project, there weren't any incentives, but basically because of this committee was formed, anything all these other ministries were then involved, and they felt involved. And so that's how DSCWM, this Department of Watershed and Soil Conservation, could implement the project. So without incorporating this element, it was really difficult, for them to get the buy-in from the national, from the ministry. And so I would say incentivize it. I mean, there can be reward systems. I mean, if different departments can be encouraged to work together. In Nepal, at the moment, the energy and water ministries, they weren't working together previously. So if a dam was built, it was for either hydropower, and then another one was just for irrigation. And now they're also making plans for multi-purpose projects and they've seen that there is advantage in also collaborating. So yeah.
It's probably could you save your question for later? I would like to go on to the next panelist because she is specialized actually in multi-stakeholder dialogues, as I learned. So I would like to welcome Xiaoting Jones. She's a researcher at IIED. She works currently in topics related to ZEF+, and also heavily working with the private sector, food demand and forestry, ecosystem-based adaptation and community-based adaptation issues, and even multi-stakeholder dialogues, and you might be able to help us a bit to understand here more. Before you joined IIED, I understand that you worked in China with different environmental protection agencies, NGOs, but also business consulting companies. So you have a very broad experience, and that mainly speaks to the forestry sector. So I would like to welcome you very warmly, and listening to your inputs.
Sorry, I haven't prepared beautiful slides. But I'm currently working on a wide range of issues, but I'm leading on a project called Ecosystem-Based Approach to Adaptation. I do have beautiful pamphlets for everyone. And we're basically responding to a key challenge Arno eloquently pointed out, that the reality is that the great infrastructures are favored in a lot of the adaptation strategies. And as Arno said, it's because there's a lack of systematic comparison to the green infrastructures. And we have been looking at all these great cases on the ground, and what you can find in Panorama on what people are doing successfully to use the nature-based solution for adaptation. But how do we communicate it much louder to the policymakers? How do we respond to a key question? I think all of us here to respond is how to scale it up. So we come up with this, again, a beautiful booklet, I have more copies, on a common framework that we can use to synthesize some of the evidence of the effectiveness and how we can do ecosystem-based adaptation. And going back to that beautiful diagram Arno showed on the definition of EBA, we're really looking at the 4 great aspects of EBA that need to be effective. It's using nature to help us, so it needs to be effective for human society to adapt. That's one key area. And at the same time, we're using nature, so we have to ensure that nature and the natural resources we're based on, they're resilient. So the EBA solution need to be effective for ecosystems as well. And then obviously there's a policy institutional barriers we need to keep in mind to make the practice actually effective. So there's also a great component of what are the policy and institutional structures and aspects we need to take into consideration in designing and implementing ecosystem-based adaptation. And then sometimes that we forget, but Arno's slides and some of the discussion already bubbling up, so how much it will cost? Is that cost effective? Can the poor nations actually be able to afford those type of adaptation options? So that's a financial and economic aspect, but also whether it delivers economic benefits to the local community. Is it really great for them? Can someone in the family who is just caring about their food on the ground, they can actually use this to generate more livelihood options for them, so this adaptation activity is also can be sustained at a local level. So that's a 4 aspects that we're looking at, and we're using this to look at 12 countries, 13 different projects of EBA, and generate those, collate those evidence to say when EBA is effective and how we can make it effective. And to probably respond to that question of how do we scale up, I think the next stage is not only using that 4 component to think about collating evidence, but it's basically a fundamental 4 components for consideration when designing any type of adaptation activities. Green infrastructure in a changing climate is a very reactive approach for adaptation. You look at one specific climate risk and you design a green infrastructure. It's there. It's less adaptive. But as we know, and science tells us, a very biodiverse, very diverse ecosystem offer you greater solutions. Facing the vulnerability of climate change, we can actually, in a more biodiverse ecosystem, have more solutions and more tools to help us adapt. So fundamentally, ecosystem-based adaptation is a more proactive way to help us manage risks. And that, I think, need to be more prominently communicated to a lot of the policymakers. And it's not just in a conceptual stage. We've already seen some of the examples in the countries we work in where they are realizing that actually it's very costly if we just use the green infrastructure. If we look at the long term and thinking about how we look at all these climate models, 5 different climate change models, they all tell us different things. Some tell this area would be drier, some tell us this area would be rainfall. All we can conclude from this expensive 6 models of climate change is that there's going to be more risks. There's going to be more variability in the future for our country to be sustainably developing. So what we then tell them is that really you should look at your ecosystem to use what we know to have a diverse ecosystem to support you to adapt. And we've seen that happening in Chile through our project. The ministry in charge of risk reduction is working actively now with the Ministry of Environment to think about how, for example, how to use the forest on the slopes to combat avalanches in the long term. We've seen in China, the National Reform and Development Agency is actively thinking about how to use some of the ecosystem payment services for the adaptation strategies. And we've seen it also in Peru, where the government is thinking more consistently in how to use the ecosystem and to deliver not only adaptation but mitigation benefits, for example, REDD+. And then we're also seeing it in Mexico, we're seeing it in Kenya, we're seeing it in South Africa, where the government has a very comprehensive EBA policies. But to come back to probably the question on how to do that cross-sectoral engagement, how we make different ministries talk to each other. when I go to developing countries, and I'm from a developing country, I'm from China, I always think like when we tell the government what they need to do, what can we give them as a very good example of a well-funded government, not like in sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes when governments, the annual income is probably less than here, a provincial government budget. How do we tell those governments which have very constrained budget to work with each other? What is the incentive? What's the best example we can give them? In UK, does the Ministry of Energy talk to the Ministry of Agriculture? Is there cross-sectoral collaboration? In Germany, does your ministries talk to each other and consult each other on their policy design? A lot of the times the answer is no. So how do we expect those very poor, constrained governments to talk to each other? And I think that's where we're hitting the wall, is because actually the incentive is not there, and the reality is that. But the good news is, as our panelists, again, a beautiful policy brief that I can share later. The good news, as Florencia and, sorry, I forgot your name. Let me see, Luda, also pointed out where the incentive is, and I'm a political economy specialist, so that's where I always think about what's the drivers of people's actions, what's the incentives. It's at the local level. As you say, communities, like, they don't really have sectoral silos. And but as the moderator also correctly pointed out, ecosystem-based adaptation need to be at the ecosystem level. And we can't just looking at our own farm. We need to be talking to our neighbors. We need to be looking at a broader ecosystem to collaborate. So what's the scale that actually makes sense? And usually what we find is at the local government scale, the county level scale. So you have all these different ministries making the beautiful policies in the capital, and they all pass down to the local government. And they need to figure out, okay, I don't really have that much money. The Ministry of Environment gave me this policy to do this, and the Ministry of Agriculture gave me, how do I prioritize? And it usually ended up in a democracy, it's ended up to be what voter wants. But then at the same time, we found that working with local governments, there's also incentive for them to think about long term, to think about how to work with their communities and how to make them think, help them to think about how they can tell different ministries, hey, we help you achieve your policy goals to all these certain levels. So this is incentive at the local government and the county government to do that sectoral thinking. And usually it's less blurred at the local and the county government level, what are the sectoral priorities, and sometimes the Ministry of Irrigation may not even be at the local level. So the government really have that power, and the government really have that incentive to think cross-sectorally. And that's what we find quite successful, for example, in Kenya. But the key also is when they think about the cross-sectoral priorities, which they can, you need to give them the power then to implement them. And that comes to finance. So we're seeing a lot of decentralized government. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where I mostly work, the national policy already say that we need to decentralize our decision-making. And those decision-making, I forgot to mention, actually respond better to the local communities. And it's better and easier, as you say, to have participatory processes because it's at a local, and they work with constituency who would vote for them in the office. So there's incentive for them there to actually engage with the local constituency as well. So, but then they don't have the money sometimes to fund that. So that's what we've been pushing at IIED is for the central government to think, hey, you shouldn't be holding all the money maybe, like think about some localized funding. And we have a really great example in Kenya, where in Isiolo County, we have established that adaptation fund at the county level. And they have a very participatory process within all the communities living in the county every year to come up with adaptation priorities and to vote on what are the things they want to fund this year with the limited funding, and informed by some of the scientists and researchers on what are the priority may be. But the local people really take the ownership. So I think that's a great example, and I'll do an ad before I finish. There's a climate and development day organized by IIED over this weekend, and there will be more examples, especially people from the field, to tell you how this has been successful. And it's free registration, and you don't need to have a badge for UNFCCC to get in. So do get online and register. I have my colleague Matt here. if you have any question about the climate and development, they do ask him, and you will learn more about how to do this on the ground over this weekend, if you can spare your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very passionate intervention. So, I'm conscious of the time, so I would suggest one question, and then we go to Michael. Michael.
Hi, I'm Mike Beck from the Nature Conservancy. Really appreciated your intervention there, Dr. Jones. And my comment, partly to you, question partly to you, partly reflection on Arno's talk as well. And it seem surprising that we're now in a circumstance where we have to convince folks that working with nature is actually a part of sustainable and adaptive solutions. And just as you mentioned, that most of our gray infrastructure is often not well designed for problems at present, much less future problems. So how do we get to the point at which we're really evaluating these nature-based solutions fully against any of these other development decisions? You know, I would argue that we should require our institutions to be assessing, doing all of those cost-effectiveness assessments. I think that that's at least one way. Do you agree? Do you see other alternatives?
Yeah, great question. And I probably can speak more eloquently from China, where I came from, and it's a king of man-made solutions, from the Great Wall to now this completely revamping the Silk Road. So we're really good at the great infrastructure, and it's all fueled by short-term thinking in a way to count basically. It's the key thing, I think, come back to the 101 natural resource management and economics of natural resource management, how we count those co-benefits, those valuable co-benefits, ecosystem-based adaptation actually delivering in the long term against those huge dollar signs of infrastructure project. And we get an example in South Africa, where in the rangeland restoration, we did a cost-benefit analysis for rangeland restoration and the green infrastructure project. And the result is actually rangeland restoration is more costly than the great infrastructure, because the soil is so depleted. To recover it takes so long. If you use those net present value, you discount it for like 30 or 40 years. There's no way to basically compete with great infrastructure. But then the key thing we advocated, and the Conservation South Africa, our local partner, advocated, is the job creation. So it actually, the restoration, because it's so expensive, it employs a lot of local people, and that area is really poor. It has very high unemployment rate. So the local government, again, tried to get votes, said, okay, we'll go for this really expensive restoration because that it creates jobs, next election get elected. So again, short-term thinking. Like I think for me, back from being an idealistic conservationist and then to start working on the ground and thinking about how to engage with policy, I guess we just need to really think about how the policymakers really think while we push them to the right direction, to think more long-term. We also need to accept basically short-term incentives is really what matters, even in UK, where the Brexit vote happened. It's daily, we're bracing it daily on that short-term thinking and respond to populism, and so it gets really philosophical. Sorry, but basically, coming back to the solution, I think, yeah, like what it works on the ground shows us we need to understand the drivers of why they make those decisions and speak to those drivers, and that's unfortunate reality. I completely agree. Why do we need to convince them that a bird is worth surviving? Well, like it's our duty. Or in sub-Saharan Africa, where we find religion is really important, and the religious practice is really important. Part of the amaze me in India sometimes that the ecosystem is so well protected is part of people's belief, part of the people's fundamental belief that nature is God, and certain species are God, we shouldn't hunt them. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we've been thinking about how to basically link that religious beliefs and the religious authority at the local level to make them to preach more about ecosystem-based solutions for adaptation to nature, to listen to your God and think about how to adapt to it. So those are kind of some extreme cases, but I think that's how we can communicate in reality to affect or upscale more of the solutions.
Thank you very much. So you might think that Michael has got a really hard time after your speech. I hope you are up to the challenge. Actually, you delivered a very good entry point for Michael's talk, maybe. I don't know what he will say exactly, but I could think of. So you mentioned that prioritization is actually one of the issues we have to think about. And here we have Michael Hagenlocher. He is actually a risk and vulnerability assessment expert. So he's developing new methodologies based on ecosystem-based risk and vulnerability assessment, and also application examples in the praxis. This can relate to adaptation, identification of adaptation options, ecosystem-based adaptation options, but also he was involved in a new initiative of ensure resilience to try to find ways to prioritize countries where insurance-based solutions might have the best entry point. So with that, I would like to invite you to your intervention.
Thank you very much, Zita. Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome also from my side. I'm actually really amazed to see so many people in this room. It's really packed, and I think it also demonstrates very nicely the growing interest in and appetite for solutions that go beyond conventional soft and hard adaptation options. I actually would like to use the opportunity in my statement to take one step back and reflect a little bit on the first half of the title of this session, which is EBA planning. Since I believe that actually planning is really important when it later comes to successful implementation, to the sustainability of the options that we want to implement, but also to questions around the uptake of EBA. And I would like to, drawing on experiences that we were able to gain together with colleagues from Europe who are in this room and colleagues from GIZ who are in this room, drawing on experiences that we were able to make while developing a new guidebook actually for decision makers and practitioners on how to do risk assessments in the context of EBA in order to inform EBA. I would like to critically reflect on 4 key issues or 4 key challenges which I think are crucial to stimulate the discussion here a little bit. And I think many of the things have been said by the previous speakers, but I think we're all aware that there's still a major disconnect between perceived and observed vulnerabilities and risks and adaptation action on the ground, and this needs urgent alignment. And I'll come back to this. Another thing that has been said earlier in this discussion series, and I think it's very true, sad but true, but is that we still see silo thinking, and this is much more widespread than we would like this to be. And a third thing that has been very enthusiastically emphasized again today is, and I think we all agree, is that we need participatory approaches and ownership in order to make sure that EBA implementation can be successful. And the fourth thing I would like to talk about briefly is that became very evident over the past months when talking to many people, that we need new strategies and approaches for the M&E of adaptation. So the word evidence is important here. And let me come back to the planning part, and this is where I want to talk about, or where the vulnerability and the risk assessments come into play. So ideally, vulnerability and risk assessments focusing on social ecological systems, if they're conducted in a participatory manner, they can be one piece in the puzzle in responding to some of these challenges. And why is that? So first of all, by providing evidence or information on where do we see certain risk or vulnerability hotspots, but also what are the underlying drivers of vulnerability of social ecological systems, we can help actually to bridge that gap between the perceived and observed vulnerabilities and the adaptation action on the ground. And I think this is very important and needs more work. Second, we all know that vulnerability and risk is something that is multidimensional, particularly when we talk about social ecological systems and try to understand the role of ecosystems and the services in these assessments. Being complex and being multidimensional also means that it provides a huge opportunity to actually break the silos and bring different experts from different disciplines, stakeholders from different backgrounds, different ministries. We talked a lot about cross-sectoral sectoral challenges, but also the affected communities together in an idealized world where we do these risk assessments in a participatory manner. And hence, ecosystem-based adaptation options that arise out of these participatory risk assessments have perhaps a chance to also be sustainable in terms of being socially accepted, culturally accepted, politically feasible. And third, what I want to say is that I think that by doing risk assessments in a repeated manner, we have a tremendous opportunity which we're not using yet, actually. And by repeated risk assessments, I really mean to do risk assessments before, during, and after the implementation of EBA, to also try to better understand the effectiveness of EBA in achieving some of the primary adaptation benefits. And I'm not saying that this is easy, that it's a straightforward approach, that it's clear, because there's a lot of other influences that come into play here as well. But I think it could be one element out of multiple elements contributing to better understanding the effects, the direct and the indirect effects of EBA. And I think this is crucial. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, actually. Thank you.
So discussion.
1 minute.
We have questions to Michael. Yeah, Mark.
My name is Mar from the University, and we've heard before several of the speakers talking about the challenges in implementation, basically with the local governments and with also how to involve and create ownership. But what about the donors? And in this particular case, I think most of the EBA actions still come in the format of projects. So has the project cycle, the project management adapted to include these necessities, these requirements of having more time dedicated for participatory risk assessment, having people trained to do participatory, all the resources, the time, the investment, mobilization of people to the ground from an early phase 0, that is usually very, very tight and usually just making the suitcase and going. It has to be stretched. So also the monitoring, because EBA needs more time, and we know that it needs people dedicated to that. And so how has the project cycle management adapted?
Who could answer that?
So when we brought up this idea for the project that I mentioned, one of the concerns that the Asian Development Bank had was it's not going to cost a lot of money. So they wanted to fund a large program, a large project, and something like this, forest conservation, it wasn't interesting for them. But the last few years, however, I've been seeing a lot more interest from the donor community in these EBA concepts, also because it's associated with sustainability. And and everyone wants to incorporate sustainability into their programs, and then this EBA approach really adds value to that. So this is my experience, that it's getting more accepted and getting promoted more as well.
Michael wanted to
No, please go ahead. You wanted to say something as well.
Francie.
Yeah, two. all together. One, two. Well, yeah, it is a very good question. I think that we need advocacy not only for governments, but also for donors and international cooperation. For example, in our case, when we started with EBA, we were working with IUCN, and the idea was, okay, we need a project to implement an two EBA measures in 2 different sites with a low regret approach and with local approval in 3 months. Sorry, we cannot do that. Okay, for a real participatory process, just for the appraisal, making consultations with the local communities, we needed 9 months. But the interesting thing was that when we ended the vulnerability assessment, we already had the EBA measure designed with the people. We worked with a team of external researchers and local experts together in the field, together, looking at different options, thinking together with a scientific coordinator, trying to develop a good knowledge dialogue. We need that, and we need time to do that. There are not shortcuts. And then we need to explain that to the donors. And we need to have time to do it. And we need people trained to do that. Well done. Because participatory, we know, everything and nothing could be, right? Then, yes, we need methodologies. When someone is developing a methodology for vulnerability assessment for ecosystem-based adaptation, are you sure that your methodology will improve local ownership? Or it is designed for external researchers only to develop that? And in that case, do you give those external researchers the tools to incorporate local perspective or not? Or it's just do it? Oh, okay, how? Okay, and in the universities, do you train your practitioners to do that? No. In fact, participatory processes sometimes are bad words, right? Okay, let's start doing advocacy at the universities, at the international cooperation, donors, governments. Just, yeah.
I would like to give it now to Michael because he is a bit short on questions.
I think it's a very important question. And I think we could talk about this for ages, I guess. And there's many things to say, but I just want to emphasize 2 points. One is, I think when you talk to donors, you need to think about value for money. And this goes a little bit into the direction of the comment raised by Mike Beck here. So I think we need more work on cost effectiveness of EBA, but we should also go beyond that. I think we should also make a strong case to look into social acceptance and things like this. And we should not only look at the direct adaptation benefits, but we also need to better understand and have new methods to also evaluate the co-benefits of EBA. And I think this can provide a very convincing argument to donors. That's one point. And the other is, I'm sometimes wondering exactly that question. Why is it that although we have all this wealth of knowledge on EBA, that we still see people investing in conventional adaptation options? And I think we have, partly this is also related to telling success stories. I think we're good in, we have this knowledge, and but we have to ask ourselves, are we communicating the success stories we have? Arno has mentioned mangroves as an example. Are we communicating this to the right audience? And I think here we could do better. And I think we also could do better in terms of not always using the mangrove example, because there is a lot of additional EBA options that actually provide a lot of adaptation benefits and co-benefits. And I think we could do better in also communicating this and making this interesting to the donors.
Yes. So we are getting the time from Alma. Do you have a short one?
Yeah, very short one, of course. No, thanks. I just want to add on this a little bit, Michael. I couldn't agree more. I think we have an issue here. The issue is how do we communicate? How do we communicate EBA? And I think the problem or the challenge, let me rather say, it starts with the term itself. It's a rather bulky term, and I think we have to see what is behind. So in GIZ, I think we have some close to, I should think, 100 projects worldwide that deal with EBA issues without being called EBA. So there's a lot of even more knowledge around that we think we find in those projects that have that as a heading. So we need to use that, and we need to communicate that. And I think we have to be very careful if we start teaching our audience what is EBA. I think on the political level it makes a lot of sense. But I think on the local level, teaching people what is EBA, the concept of EBA, I think we have to rethink that. So that was my short statement.
Thank you very much. So our time expired. I would like to close with one observation, probably, because I think we tend to mention that hybrid solutions are also of relevance, but I don't know too many people who are actually really working on hybrid solutions and trying to figure out in which constellations ecosystem-based and data infrastructure would work best together. It was mentioned also on Monday in the GIZ event about the Committee of Taxes for EBA. There was one speaker mentioning this need for more hybrid solutions as well. I think this is somewhere lingering around and not many people paying attention to it, and that would be probably my closing remark, that it would be interesting avenue for the next 2 years to also focus on those issues. Thank you very much for coming, and please give a big hand to our panelists.